I see people are continuing to pop in. Okay, perfect. Let's get started with our webinar. Again, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the organizers of this solution session, that is the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition and its people pillar co-chairs, which includes UNICEF, UNDP, UNESCO, WFP, and UN Women, as well as co-organizer Wellcome Trust, I would like to all welcome you to this session on accelerating inclusive social development through AI-enabled evidence and evaluation synthesis. My name is Thomas Rossmüller. I'm an evaluation partnerships and capacity development specialist at the UNICEF Evaluation Office in New York, and I have the pleasure to be your moderator for the session today. It's quite a packed session, so let me give you a quick overview of what we'll go through today. We'll start off with just a quick context from my side, how this session fits into the priority topics and response to them of the Second World Summit on Social Development. We'll give you a quick introduction, even though a lot of people seem to be familiar with evidence synthesis, but we'll quickly explain what it is. Then Carrie will introduce to you the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition and why it was established. Right after that, we'll jump into the first synthesis under the people pillar, which is on social assistance. Atika Pasha here from C4AD will present the findings from that synthesis. Afterwards, John Lavis will present ESIC, the Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative, and its foundational investments and what this initiative tries to achieve in the next few years. Carrie will speak a bit about the UN system and the coalition and how it works with ESIC and what the UN and the coalition are trying to do in terms of evaluation synthesis. And after that, Shiv will present us a quick look into the future from the perspective of different stakeholders, how evidence synthesis will be done and how it will look like in 2 years from now. We reserved some time for Q&A for you, so feel free to use the feature. We'll come to that in a second. And after that, we'll have some closing remarks from Judith Friedman from WFP. So on the Q&A feature, you should find that at the top of your screen. Please use that to ask any questions you might have throughout the whole presentation and different segments to the different speakers. You will also see questions from other attendees, participants. You can upload these if they're interesting, and we'll use these questions then at the end to have a discussion with the speakers. Okay. Before we jump in, just quickly to the context. So, of course, this solution session here is part of the Second World Summit on Social Development. During this summit, we look back at the first World Summit for Social Development that was held in 1995 in Copenhagen. And there, the world came together and committed to, among other things, to eradicate poverty, promote full and productive employment, and foster social integration. Now it's 30 years later. 30 years, well, it doesn't even sound that long, but it's quite a long time frame where we made a lot of progress. Just to give you a flavor of that, 1995 was also the year where the internet became a little more widely available to the public. Some of you might remember the modems. It was when Internet Explorer was released and some of the companies and services that we all use were established in that year. So it was quite a different era back then. Now it's 2025 and we made a lot of progress in these 30 years, not only technology-wise, but also, of course, on social development issues. We lifted 1.5 billion people out of extreme poverty. The working poverty fell significantly from 27 to just around 7%. at least half of the world's population is now covered by the minimum one social protection scheme. So quite some positive and impressive change and progress that we made. But we still face many of the same issues we faced back then. For example, we still have 808 million people remaining and living in extreme poverty. And actually, the number is 1.1 billion people that face some form of multidimensional poverty. While the working poverty has decreased, in most countries, the income inequality has been increasing. Also, there is a lot of progress on social protection schemes. There are still wide gaps in coverage in lower income countries especially. So overall, we also see that still persons with disabilities, older persons, and other vulnerable groups remain excluded from most of these benefits and that progress. So while there is a lot of progress, still we face many of the same issues. But what has changed a lot since then is, of course, technology and the tools that we have to work on, analyze, and hopefully at some point solve these issues. The big thing at the moment is, of course, artificial intelligence. It's everywhere. It's a part of this panel. I'm sure many of you either joined this session because of the interest in artificial intelligence, used Copilot or ChatGPT before, or are somehow familiar with it. But while we all use it, we should not forget that still 1/3 of the world's population doesn't even have access to the internet. So while some people and countries and percentages are racing ahead with reaping the benefits of AI for their daily work, including, of course, also our speakers here, a big part of the world population still doesn't even have access to the evidence synthesis infrastructure collaborative.org site or Google or any part of the internet. So there are huge equity concerns with using, well, the internet and now very advanced tools like AI. Okay, let's come back to this session today and how it relates to these points. We here working with and on the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition and ESIC. We don't have the illusion that we will have some magic formula to solve all of these problems here. But we're convinced that evidence is a key ingredient to make sustainable progress in our efforts. But it's not just any evidence. For evidence to make the most difference, it needs to be credible, timely, accessible, and user-focused, among many other things. There is a ton of evidence out there already from research evaluations of the past many years, 30 years. But a lot of it doesn't meet credibility standards. A lot of it is outdated, even if it was launched in 2020, and it's just not relevant anymore. A lot of that evidence is behind paywalls, or it's only accessible in one language. And certainly most of it is not presented in an accessible or understandable way for many of the important users and stakeholders, especially policy and decision makers. And our solution here today that we present, and our belief is that evidence synthesis is one powerful and vital tool to deliver evidence that is credible, timely, accessible, and user-focused, and help us make sense of this information overflow that we live in. And when we combine it with artificial intelligence, we can even make that evidence and evaluation synthesis even faster and cheaper, more up-to-date and more credible to truly accelerate progress on social development. Just one last point. With all of that, we of course should not forget that there are these equity concerns in terms of using AI. So it can't be that just a few high-income countries can use these tools and be involved here. Countries that can afford, this highly resource-intense artificial intelligence programs, and of course also the costly access to academic literature and evidence data. while all of the other countries remain excluded. So that's why I want to emphasize that in these initiatives that we're going to discuss and present here today, equity is considered from the beginning on as a foundational principle. You will hear more about that from John just in a few minutes. So this is what this solution session will present to you today. How we can accelerate inclusive social development through AI-enabled evidence and evaluation synthesis. Well, I talked now a lot about evidence synthesis, but what actually is that thing? And for that, let me hand over to my colleague Shiv Bakrania from UNDP. Shiv is a senior evaluation specialist with a focus on synthesis. He works at the UNDP Independent Evaluation Office, where he uses his 15 years of experience in synthesis, knowledge management, and research to oversee UNDP's synthesis activities and lead the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition Secretariat. So over to you, Shiv.
Thank you, Thomas. So yeah, I'm going to do a quick 5-minute overview of what is synthesis. We did the poll at the beginning of this call, and 100% of people had expert knowledge of synthesis. So perhaps this is all preaching to the choir, but I'm going to do it anyway. So next slide, please, Thomas. Okay, so what is synthesis? I put in a very kind of plain language definition in there, and we're saying that it's the process of bringing together information from many different studies, evaluations, or data sources to identify patterns, draw broader conclusions, and understand what works for whom and in what context. And on the right hand side there, you can see a little diagram that I put together. At the top there, you can see many different sources of evidence coming from different types of evidence, which is then synthesized. So we're collating the evidence, we're appraising the quality, we're analyzing that to draw out some insights which can hopefully inform policy decisions. So that's the very simple solution that we're presenting here regarding synthesis. Okay, next slide, please, Thomas. Okay, so we feel that synthesis can provide trustworthy evidence for complex decisions. And why do we believe in the power of synthesis to do that? Firstly, it's because with synthesis, we take very systematic, transparent, and replicable approaches to collating and analyzing evidence. So it transforms scattered or sometimes biased information into credible, comparable, and context-aware insights. And this is the kind of trustworthy evidence needed for complex system-level decisions. We're applying, as I said, transparent and replicable methods to assess the quality of the evidence, to critically assess it, and to integrate this evidence across different sources. We try to identify convergence and divergence in the findings, to distinguish stronger from weaker evidence, and to interpret the implications from the evidence with expert judgment. So we're trying to, with synthesis, we're trying to consistently apply appraisal standards, to consistently and systematically extract evidence, to aggregate or combine findings and conclusions, to produce decision-ready insights rather than general overviews. Next slide, please, Thomas. So we truly believe that synthesis provides a deeper and more reliable foundation than some of the, well, let me say, competitors in this case. So one of the maybe potential competitors is AI, okay? Trying to press a button with ChatGPT and get a summary of what we load into it. What AI is doing, if we're using it in that way, is just restating content without assessing the quality, the rigor, or the relevance of what goes into it. And taking this approach carries risks of bias and inaccuracies. I'm sure everyone's aware of the kind of potential risks of using AI, so I don't need to labor the point there. Other competitors, another type of competition is with the kind of traditional standard literature review. that often exist in academia, perhaps in other sectors. So these literature reviews describes what is known, but they lack the systematic approaches that synthesis takes to the inclusion of evidence and to appraising its quality, and then to exploring the comparability across different sources of evidence. So essentially, we're cherry picking to justify an argument that we have with literature reviews. And then with single studies or evaluations, so a key underlying principle of synthesis is that we're looking across bodies of evidence, right? And if we're looking at a single study or evaluation to inform a decision, we're only looking at one specific study in one specific context with limitations for how that evidence and how those findings can be generalized across different contexts. Next slide, please. I believe I'm at the end of my section, so I'll hand back over to Thomas.
Thank you very much, Shiv, for this quick overview of evidence synthesis. Now we'll hand over to Carrie to give us an introduction to the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition and how it was established. So just very briefly, Carrie Albright is the Deputy Director and the Principal Advisor for Evaluation at the UNICEF Evaluation Office. She's a social and political scientist with more than 25 years of experience in international development and evidence-informed decision-making. And Carrie serves as the co-chair of the leadership group of the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition, and she's also one of the co-chairs of the coalition's People Pillar. So, Carrie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Thomas, and nice to see some familiar faces on the line. That said, I know that maybe there are some people who've never heard of the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition, so it's my job just to give you a super quick introduction and background about what it is. Next slide, please, Thomas. Okay, so some of you will know that it's the coalition, for short, has been around for a few years now. It was originally set up by UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, during the COVID years, where they really realized that we couldn't go out and do primary data collection for evaluations, but actually there was a lot that we could do to take better stock of the existing knowledge that we had, the evaluative knowledge base. There was also a recognition that last time round, the MDGs were never properly evaluated, that we really needed to do something urgent to catch up on the SDGs. And in fact, even during COVID, we were seeing reversals for the very first time. So it wasn't just about acceleration, it was about catch up. So it was really very serious. We, across UN agencies alone, have around 14,000 evaluations that are currently sitting in our shared database, which traditionally had mostly been used about in looking inwards to our own agencies to improve delivery or policy, etc. But actually, this was quite an untapped goldmine. A lot of syntheses, when they're produced traditionally, have tended to use impact evaluation to answer sort of what works types of questions, but not so much other forms of evaluations. And the sorts of evaluations that UN agencies tend to produce are often around process and performance, which can help answer some of the, not just the what works, but also the how and why, so implementation factors, etc. So it was a missed opportunity not to make use of this. UNICEF came on board as a co-chair quite early on. We have at least 45 UN agencies that are involved, and just a short snapshot below of some of the co-leads of the particular pillars that I'll talk about in a minute. But increasingly now, the mandate is expanding beyond just UN agencies, and really now the coalition focuses on covering evaluation offices of the multilateral system generally, so also including multilateral development banks and international financial institutions. Next slide, please. So where we've ended up, as you can see, our mission is really, as Shiv and Thomas have said, we really believe that evaluative evidence brings something new to the party, but we really need to, with this sort of information overload that Thomas was talking about, make much better use of synthesis to be able to see patterns that are emerging over and above single studies. Next, please. So last slide, just to give you a bit of an overview. This is how we're set up. Key to the structure, all of the SDGs are organized into what we call pillars. So 5 buckets, the 5 Ps, if you like, the partnerships, people, planet, prosperity, peace buckets that you can see outlined there. We have already produced a first synthesis on partnerships. I won't go into the lessons that we've learnt. We can come back to that if there's a need in the questions. There's a peace synthesis that is also out. You can have a look on the coalition website. And today we're launching the first synthesis, hopefully of many, that will be produced under the people pillar. Just so you're aware, the Sustainable Development Goals that come under the people pillar are those relating to ending poverty, ensuring zero hunger, good health, education, and gender equality. And the first synthesis that our colleague Attica will present in detail in a minute, really we wanted to focus around the social assistance theme, and she can explain more about what we mean by that, but also focusing very much on equity considerations around making sure that we left no one behind, including also looking at some of the implementation factors I mentioned below. The broad setup, as well as the co-chairs, you can see there's a leadership group, some people involved in that, include Daniel Ortega from the Latin America Caribbean Development Bank, Will Moy, who is the CEO of the Campbell Collaboration, Andrea Cook, who's from the UN System-Wide Evaluation Office, Isabelle Mercier, my fellow co-chair at UNDP, and John Lavis, who will be introduced later on. And you heard from Shiv as head of the Secretariat. We have a group of friends who, crudely speaking, are members of member states across the UN. We're in the process of setting that up now. People who believe in evaluation, believe in synthesis and how it can help to accelerate the SDGs. Happy to answer more questions on that if need be, but it's not really the focus for today. Back to you for now, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Carrie. And we will hear a little bit more about the coalition's work, especially with ESIC, in just a few minutes. Now we'll come to the presentation of the findings relevant also to the summit, especially from C4ED and Attica Pasha, that you've probably all been waiting for. Before we jump into that, let me just quickly check some of your knowledge from the social assistance sphere. So you should see a quick quiz popping up just with some 4 true or false questions, and you can answer that in the meantime, and you will then hear what was right and what was wrong from Attica in the presentation. While you do that, let me introduce Attica to you. So Attica Pasha is the research director at C4ED, the Center for Evaluation and Development. She's a trained development economist with a PhD in economics and over a decade of experience in research and evaluation across sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia. She has a PhD from the University in Göttingen and a bachelor's and master's in economics in India. She has a lot of experience in complex data collection, mixed method evaluation designs, capacity building, and stakeholder engagement. And she was the leader of the evidence synthesis on social assistance that she's now going to present to you. So with that, let me check if we have responses. And over to you, Attica.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I also believe I take control now from you. So, and thank you for the good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present the results from the people pillar evidence synthesis. As you can see, the title, the goal of the synthesis was to understand how social assistance is reaching the furthest behind, but specifically looking at outcomes related to the SDGs 1 to 5, which Carrie briefly talked about. So before before I dive into talking a bit more about the synthesis, let's just take a few moments to remind ourselves again about the first five SDGs. And here I'll also try to give a brief overview of what that implies for outcomes, right? So as Carrie already mentioned, the first SDG, which is about reducing poverty, is basically ensuring that also simultaneously no one is left behind. And it revolves around expanding access to income, livelihoods, employment opportunities, as well as social assistance. So for our review, we focus on outcomes related to employment, income earnings, expenditure, consumption, and so on, but also hygiene, wash outcomes are included within here, which is part of basic access to basic services. Under SDG 2, we're looking at basically ending or focusing on ending hunger, simultaneously achieving food security, as well as ensuring better nutrition for all individuals. The third box in green is the SDG 3, which aims to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all people at all ages. So again, in terms of how we measure it, we're looking at, for example, maternal and child health, and then you can tackle issues such as access to basic services, essential health services, for example. The fourth SDG is about providing inclusive, equitable, and quality education. And now here we're not only talking about children in school, we're talking about early childhood all the way to adulthood. So this is basically about education. And then finally, last but not the least, the fifth SDG here is relates to gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. It's to remind ourselves that basically progress across all SDGs, not just these, depends on accessing barriers that women and girls constantly face. So this can range from unequal access to resources, exposure to violence, limited decision-making powers in their households and communities. And so within these set of outcomes, we were interested in, through the synthesis, in compiling and understanding effectiveness of these social assistance programs and what can help to accelerate progress on SDGs 1 to 5, which are currently stalling or slowing down, and simultaneously ensuring that these programs are inclusive and leaving no one behind. So this equity element that Thomas mentioned before. Simultaneously, what we do observe is where are the missing gaps. So whether programs are missing certain groups, whether programs are missing certain outcomes or certain types of indicators for interventions under the 5 SDGs, and where, for example, research might just be missing. So how do we go about with the synthesis? We are basically answering 4 research questions. First is about whether do social assistance programs work, especially for those who are left behind. We're asking how and why they work, so what the mechanisms are, under what context they work. The third question is which factors accelerate progress. So we're not only trying to understand what the barriers are, but also what accelerates progress, so the facilitators and enablers. And then finally, as I already mentioned, certain gaps which we need to start filling up. If there is any evidence out there, trying to collate it as well. So now talking about social assistance very briefly, we are looking at 2 particular elements. Let's keep in mind that cash transfers are a very large element of social assistance, but there was already quite a lot of evidence and collation of synthesis related to that. And so this synthesis would not necessarily have added too much more to that evidence base. And what therefore the focus of our synthesis was on 2 separate instruments, the first being vouchers, which are basically being redeemed by the recipient to purchase specific goods or services. And now within goods, we can consider money. So they can be monetary vouchers, wherein you redeem the voucher to acquire money, or they can also relate to commodity vouchers. So for example, for the voucher, you receive food, you receive implements for agriculture, fertilizers, etc. So other kinds of inputs. The second type of instrument that we're looking at is in-kind transfers or interventions. So these are slightly different in that they are direct, regular, and predictable provision of goods and services without any monetary exchange. So to give you another few examples, we're looking at an unconditional in-kind transfer. We're looking at food transfers. So someone goes and picks up ration from the local ration provider. Or it can be linked to a particular activity. For example, a condition on attendance in school, you are provided a meal. So these midday meal programs, or for example, breakfast programs that are given to children attending schools. Another type of in-kind transfer is, for example, trainings, and that might be, for example, vocational training to improve skills, personal development training, or personal or life skills training, as well as hygiene training. These are all other types of trainings that are also considered within in-kind transfers. Right. So then coming to how the social assistance is addressing the needs of the most vulnerable, what we were interested in answering was relevant to 4 particular groups. So we wanted to answer whether these interventions were gender responsive, whether they were age responsive, and here again we're interested in the elderly as well as the youth or the children. Whether these interventions are inclusive of people with disabilities, and also whether households with multiple vulnerabilities are covered within this type of programs. So just repeating a bit what Shiv said, what we did here was take evidence that was over 4,000 studies and read through them to find almost 250 relevant studies, which included 106 impact evaluations, 46 synthesis reviews, so it's similar to the work that we're doing, and then 94 UN-led performance and process evaluations, where again the focus was on trying to understand how programs could be designed better, right? So this implementation of program element. And as you can see in the map, the evidence is actually quite geographically spread. We see a large coverage, and of course, there is a little bit of concentration in China and India, but overall, the evidence is large and represents a large set of population as well in low and middle income countries. Sorry. Right, so now coming to the results. So this is just one brief overview, which is trying to cover basically all the SDGs, the first 5, sorry. And what you see here through this green upward arrows is that overall, it appears that vouchers and in-kind transfers have favorable effects or favorable outcomes for the first 5 SDGs. And especially what you see on the rows is whether they are gender, age, disability, and multiple vulnerability responsive, right? What you then can further discern is those that are slightly darker in nature implies that here the evidence is not only favorable, but also strong. So for under gender, for example, we see that outcomes under SDG 1 and SDG 2 are particularly strong. Similarly, if one was to look at SDG 2, which is zero hunger, so nutrition and so on, there again, the use of vouchers and in-kind interventions has been not only favorable, but showing strong effectiveness for SDG 2 outcomes. Simultaneously, however, we do see some evidence gaps already, right? So we see, for example, that under SDG 5, the evidence is not necessarily, it is somewhat sparse, and that means that we cannot provide any clear conclusions. And what we do then say is that the evidence is mixed in this case, or we can't say too much about this. And particularly in the case of disability responsive interventions, the evidence is not only sparse, but under SDG 4, which is about quality education, there is really no evidence in terms of social assistance programs that are disability responsive and cater to quality education outcomes. Right, but besides these overall findings, we also wanted to dive a bit into SDG 1 specific findings and talk a bit more about how social assistance programs work under this SDG. And so to just provide a bit of context, we are aware that very often around the world, women are working in low-skilled jobs. They have limited opportunities for learning and career advancement. And so a lot of programs are actually working on vocational training, business trainings, so that women actually are enhancing their skills and economic prospects as a consequence. And in general, we find that these programs are leading to improvement not only in employment, but also formal employment or more decent work outcomes. However, what improves the effectiveness of these programs is basically two elements have come out. First is tailoring the intervention to the needs of the target group, which is in this case women, and then secondly, reducing structural barriers. So to provide a very few examples, there are several gender norms that prevent the participation of women into labor force. And so reducing this, taking trainings and awareness raising sessions around this, that's helpful. Timing the trainings with times where women are not engaged in domestic responsibilities or other work, that encourages their participation in these programs. Providing incentives in form of stipends, providing life skills trainings in order to improve their confidence are all elements that lead to these interventions being more effective. And when coming to structural barriers, if we look at distance to the training center or providing cost of transportation, reducing the domestic burden on them, perhaps by having infrastructure for childcare or providing support for childcare. These are also, again, elements that reduce structural barriers that would hinder women from participating in these programs and thereby improving their participation in the labor force and in general employment outcomes. Then, continuing that story, what we find is that where we see that women's employment opportunities are improving, there is also a tendency that their earnings and wealth is improving. So we see that generally women are earning more if they are employed, but they are also using that money to buy some assets. They are using that money for increasing consumption on food and non-food and overall household expenditures. And also what was observed that when they get profits, they are using this to smoothen consumption in terms of an economic shock. So there's also a consumption smoothing element, which means they implement fewer coping strategies. And so their labor force participation actually helps in improving their economic status indeed. But then again, moving a little further and broader, we find that as soon as we target women as recipients and their incomes are increasing, it amplifies household welfare as well. So across the board, and now this is not just relevant for SDG 1, but all other SDGs, we see that as soon as women are earning or are working, we see positive outcomes for the household, but particularly for children in terms of nutrition of the child, education of the child, so attainment or enrollment, whichever one wants to consider. There are also effects on hygiene as well as wash. And so what we see is that under SDG 1, but also other SDGs, targeting women definitely amplifies or enhances the effects or leads to broader welfare effects that are not only relevant for their own economic empowerment. However, at this point, I do want to bring a very small caveat in terms of the modality, right? So in-kind transfers do have certain limitations when now compared to cash transfers, in that with cash, you can do whatever you like, whereas in in-kind transfers, generally there's limitations in the choice the household has. So it generally implies that there are smaller welfare gains, and effectively households then may not score or these vouchers or these in-kind transfers might not serve as well in improving household welfare, for example, as cash, which several studies did report. Unfortunately, actually, in one particular case also, which was a specific setting of fragile settings in Mali, there were even unintended effects that we observed. And that was comparing two types of in-kind transfers. So one was a general food distribution versus in school-based feeding. And as far as there is no conditionality, which was general food distribution, what we observed was that the opportunity cost of sending this child, and particularly the adolescent boys, to school was not reduced. And so it was only when the in-school feeding was taking place do we see an increase in child enrollment as well as grade attainment and a reduction in their labor. On the other hand, when we look at general food distribution, so it was not linked to the schooling, there we see, for example, that adults and boys were not only more absent from school, but also more likely to be engaged in the labor market. And here the mechanism is that, especially during fragile context, adolescent boys or males in that context do their opportunity cost of schooling increases. They need to be engaged in income generating activities. Often they are even engaged in conflict itself, and thereby one really needs to context or consider the context in which the in-kind transfer is being given to allow it to work or be effective. So keeping in mind this group as well, and then bringing in, for example, not only adolescents but just in general youth. So we looked at some studies that were covering individuals between the ages of 15 and 34, so the youth, including some adolescents. And there are, again, a large number of programs that would be targeting through technical, vocational, educational, and training programs this group. And what we do see is, again, stronger employment outcomes emerge for this group. And the caveat in this place is that we consistently find that they were found with complementary support. So to give you some examples, in case of adolescents, the use of microfinance or grants to encourage their business or entrepreneurial endeavors, to provide them or link them with employers, to provide psychosocial supports, to provide them with more or reducing the structural barriers. These were all elements that actually led to their stronger employment outcomes. So as you see across both groups, bundling of these programs and reducing the structural barriers was what led to the improved employment outcomes for both groups. Finally, the last result, now this is a little more general, and again was briefly covered before, is that a social assistance program, they do aim to be inclusive, but that is not necessarily for all groups. We find a lack of results for vouchers in general. So these are not used very often in very few contexts, in fact, compared to in-kind transfers and interventions. People with disabilities, in humanitarian settings, adolescents, as well as elderly, these are several groups that are not well covered. And most importantly, what emerges from these UN-led evaluations and process and program evaluations is that programs are not necessarily aware or are not necessarily reporting or understanding these barriers, right? So why would people with disabilities not be able to participate in a program? So what are these physical barriers? Are these more social barriers? And whatever we found reported was more barriers that were relevant for in general, so lack of funding, lack of coordination, and these don't necessarily target these vulnerable groups. So keeping this in mind is important as well. So to round it all up, one key takeaway is that women are key facilitators towards the goal of reducing poverty under SDG 1, not only because their labor force participation improves their own economic situation, but also improves household welfare. The second finding, which we see reflected amongst women as well as adolescents and youth, is bundling and tailoring programs, also training programs, fosters employment and does drive social inclusion. So working on the structural barriers and bundling the support. And then finally, we find this lack of evidence for certain groups, but more importantly, also this lack of understanding as to why or what the barriers are or what the facilitators are for particular vulnerable groups to join, as well as the lack of evidence on voucher-based interventions. Thank you. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Attika, for presenting these super interesting insights of the first synthesis under the people pillar. I hope you can all see also the responses to the quiz. I think overall, some people were surprised with especially the training on health nutrition for parents and whether that leads to healthier food consumption among children, which most people thought would be true, but as we found out is not correct. And yeah, responses were mostly correct, but still divided on the other questions. So still a lot of surprises and interesting insights from the synthesis. And pulling together all of this evidence, this huge pool of evidence on SDGs 1 to 3 on social assistance within this short amount of time is a huge effort. So congratulations and thank you to you and the C4ED team for doing that within such a short amount of time. For our participants, if you have any questions on that, please use the features of Teams, the Q&A, or the chat if you want, and ask any questions there. We'll come back to that in the Q&A segment. Now, I'll take back control of the presentation here again to hand over to John Levis to give us an overview of the Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative. And John wears so many hats that I won't mention all of them, but let's just say he's, as Carrie said, big and very influential partner in this whole initiative. And yeah, he's an advisor to the Wellcome Trust for ESIC. And let's leave it there and over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. As you'll hear from my voice, I've kind of been losing it over the last few days, but it is starting to come back today. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see that in 3 slides, what I'm proposing to do is give you a bit of background about ESIC, but also give you a sense about how it could transform the type of work you've just heard about from Attica. At the top of the hour, when we began the webinar, we started with a poll, and a lot of you had experience with evidence synthesis, and those who have that type of synthesis will have a sense of just how extraordinary the amount of work that Attica and her team at C4Ed would have put into that synthesis. And ESIC is trying to make the work of Attica in future much easier, and also to connect it even more effectively to those working at the national level to put it alongside the many needed forms of local evidence. If we move on to the next slide, again, first of 3, a little bit about ESIC. So this is a community of communities committed to a collective impact approach to learning from others. So ESIC will not replace all of the important activity that has to happen at the national or the local level, bringing together local data analytics with local evaluations and so on. This is about learning from others in other jurisdictions. And as you've heard a number of my colleagues talk about, we think evidence synthesis is a really powerful tool to support that learning from other countries. The communities that are involved in this community of communities range from the many UN entities that are brought together through the coalition. And I have to update my number there. I see from Carrie's slide, it's 45 UN entities. But we also have the world's largest producers of evidence synthesis, groups like Cochrane in the health space, Campbell covering many sectors. We have networks of evidence intermediaries, science advisors, as well as groups running timely, demand-driven evidence support units, some outside government, some in universities, some supporting parliaments and within government departments. And we have more than 35 funders around the table. And today, you have me here as an advisor to the Wellcome Trust, but I also see Jen Gould, an executive at the Economic and Social Research Council, one of the founding partners in ESIC. You've heard Shiv talk about the importance of evidence synthesis as a rigorous approach to learn from all the scientific studies in the world, all of the United Nations and multilateral development evaluations. You've also heard a couple of my colleagues talk about artificial intelligence, and AI gives us speed. we think the transformation that we're on the cusp of is about AI-enabled living evidence syntheses that can deliver localized, actionable insights with both rigor and speed. While ESIC will eventually work across all sectors and regions, in the coming year, the focus is 11 sectors and 2 regions. And as Thomas foreshadowed, ESIC is particularly committed to shifting power to the Global South and, very importantly, locating equity at the heart of each step in its development. And that includes making sure that we ask questions that are about how do we not leave anyone behind. ESIC has mobilized more than $126 million in the past year to support this transformation. And if you want more information, you'll find it on the ESIC website, which will be expanded in the coming weeks and months to include a lot more detail. If we move on to the second of the 3 slides, in this first year, ESIC has made a number of foundational investments. I'm just going to focus on the first 3 that you'll see bolded. The first are sectoral hubs that will catalyze radically more timely, relevant, and affordable evidence synthesis to support SDG achievement and national or multilateral problems. We hope that 2 will be stood up by January, 4 more in June with support from the Economic and Social Research Council, and 5 more in September with support from the Wellcome Trust. You'll see that I've bolded social protection, which is particularly aligned with Atika's presentation today. But of course, the work in that space also intersects with a number of the other sectoral hubs, like, for example, inclusive economic growth. So that we hope will help to transform the very type of work that Attica described. That work, though, also needs to be connected at the country level with the evidence intermediaries who are hearing the questions that are top of mind for policymakers, finding the many needed forms of local evidence, but also now bringing in this global evidence. What have we learned from around the world, and how does that vary by groups and contexts? So ESIC will be supporting regional hubs, starting with 1 in Africa and another one in Latin America and the Caribbean that will support those impacts at the country level, often amplified through UN country teams and other multilaterals country offices. The third thing that we think will be transformative is an open data system to streamline how we share and reuse synthesis data. So imagine 2 scenarios. One is that having done all of this amazing work, Attica and her team add their data to an open data system. So the next time somebody asks a voucher question or asks a question for a particular context, they can reuse that data. Or turned around, imagine that when Attica and her team were asked to take on this work, they went to the open data system and found that the vast majority of studies and UN and MDV evaluations had already been looked at, the data extracted, the quality assessed, and then they could reuse that data and then update it to the present. If we move on to the third and final slide, these are some of the things that ESIC can offer. Access to trustworthy, actionable insights on the big questions of our time, coming from these policy-scale, AI-enabled living evidence syntheses. Attica did a great job of zeroing in on 6 actionable insights, 3 takeaway messages. Imagine that you would have access to that at any moment on all of the big questions of our time. Second thing that ESIC will offer, access to the AI-ready data underpinning these insights, so that if you wanted to contextualize the insights for a particular group or context, or you wanted to adjust how studies were identified and selected or how evidence was extracted, appraised, and synthesized, you can do it. So you could take this incredibly rich data that Attica and her team have produced and mix and match it in ways that are appropriate to the local context in which you're operating. The final thing that I'll note is at the very bottom, the aspiration to build this data through APIs into the workflows of organizations, UN agencies, multilateral development banks, but also national governments. Imagine that an analyst in a multilateral development bank doing a diagnostic workup on on the very issue that Attica was exploring. Imagine that they had that data immediately available to them. Or if they're doing a project analysis, thinking about a multi-billion-dollar investment, they would have immediate access to that data and could look at the local context-specific data that would be relevant to an environment like the one that they are working in, and put that evidence alongside the other inputs to their decision-making. So I tip my hat to Attica and her team. Fantastic work. The aspiration of ESIC is to make that work easier for teams like Attica's, but also to enable other people to draw on that work in future and feed those insights into national and local processes. Thomas, I'll turn it back to you, and I think you're going to connect this now to Carrie and the work of the coalition.
Yes, thank you very much, John, for giving us this overview with some of your remaining voice here. Very much appreciated. And yeah, super exciting information about what ESIC will offer and the future with the regional hubs, the sectoral hubs, especially with one on social protection. Here, the open data systems and the living evidence database. Yeah, as mentioned before, let me hand over to Carrie just to connect how the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition will fit into and work with ESIC. So over to you, Carrie.
Thanks, Thomas. And I know, notice we're a little bit short on time. We're pushing the clock, so I'll try and do this quickly. And hopefully, for those that are interested, we can share the slide deck afterwards. Please go ahead, Thomas. So really just to say, I hope you've got a sense of why we in the coalition are so excited about ESIC, why we think it's a real marriage made in heaven, and we're really excited to be involved very closely in it. What we think as UN agencies and evaluation offices within the broader multilateral system, what we think we can bring to the party, if you like, are several things. So really, obviously, as evaluation officers within UN agencies, we report directly up to our boards, but we're also plugged into some of those high-level policy discussions, political decision-making platforms, including the system-wide evaluation office, which reports directly to the UN Secretary General, and all the sort of machinery around decision-making across the UN system and member states' involvements. I mentioned earlier that we actually have, 14,000 evaluations that are used internally within the UN, but maybe perhaps not so much outside. So it brings a whole new insight and we think a potential goldmine of untapped resources. But we also have synthesis specialists across the UN ourselves, evaluation researchers, etc., who can bring some of those insights into pushing the boundaries, I think, to think about what a next generation of synthesis could be, where we look at combining not just research insights, but also evaluation insights through mixed methods. Go ahead, please. We also obviously have, as the UN, we have a large footprint all over the world, I think. So it helps us to think about maybe sometimes some of the challenges that synthesis producers have found is that if you're working largely in an academic environment, you start with the product, albeit with a question, and then you're left to think about how to promote uptake at the end. We're hoping to flip that model to really think about putting the questions that government officials, UN officials, colleagues all over the world want answered, and to be able to help connect some of those dots. So the fact that we have presence at not just global level, but also regional level and national level. Many of you on the call, we plugged into government evidence champions, citizen engagement mechanisms, etc. We think adds value. And then also we have long sort of ongoing activities around national evaluation capacity development, strengthening, working with government partners to embed that sort of evaluative reasoning, critical thinking, evidence-informed decision-making skills, and help to strengthen those. And we hope this can bring a new skill set there if we also start to think about what synthesis is, and expanded synthesis to include evaluation synthesis into our national evaluation capacity development initiatives, working with existing actors in this space, parliamentarians, and others. I think, let me leave it there. I don't think, there may be one more slide, but Okay, and this just super quickly, this is really kind of what I said before. I think the vision is that we can help link synthesis into real-time policy needs at whatever level. We can help act as a bridge between that evidence generation and immediate sort of policy, practice, response, and action. But we also hope to change ourselves and to try and actually strengthen that culture of inquisitive thinking, critical thinking, and evidence-informed decision-making across all of the activities that UN and multilateral agents are involved in on a day-to-day basis. This I won't talk through. I'll share it later. These are some of the specific activities that we're actually going to be contributing to ESIC in the next couple of years. But it's really, as you can see, around helping to prioritize demand, priority questions, helping to understand how to engage in the UN system, making our own evaluations better found, helping to sort of coordinate priority topics and co-produce some of those topics. We're trying to get our own act together to produce guidance across the UN system on what evaluation synthesis as opposed to evidence synthesis looks like, but also working with experts around the world, and certainly not doing it alone, plugging into the work of many capacity strengthening, capacity sharing initiatives around the world. Back to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Carrie, for letting us how the UN system will contribute to ESIC and building this global, movement of evidence and evaluation synthesis. A lot of things where we can add value, but also a lot of tasks for our own agencies and the UN system and how to get better aligned and use the power and the value of synthesis for our own work. How will that look in 2 years, all of the stuff that you have heard today, the coalition, ESIC, and how will that look like from the perspective of different stakeholders? For that, let me hand over to Shiv again to give us a quick flavor of the near future of this initiative.
Thanks, Thomas. So yeah, I've been asked to get my crystal ball out and reimagine what evidence synthesis could look like in 2 years' time, with the goal of informing evidence decisions. So, I mean, the ultimate goal that we're aiming towards here is getting evidence where it's needed at the time it's needed, right? And that seems like a pretty obvious goal, but we've failed to do it as an evidence-informed decision-making community so far. So that's what ESIC is all about. And, you know, it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change the way on how we go about doing things. So in 2 years' time, how could the workflow look? We're really looking to move beyond static reports, static PDFs, to moving towards dynamic insight, okay? So the emphasis is not on producing the report and then seeing who reads it, which is usually very few people, but on generating this global infrastructure where we have evidence in repositories that are available and accessible to all, that is systematized according to different sectors, topics, and themes, and which at the kind of end state can be used and cut in different ways according to how it's needed at the end point, at the decision-making point. So that's really the ambition here, and you know, we have the opportunity to do that. So next slide, please. So this is what a workflow cycle could look like in terms of this new infrastructure and new activities taking place. And thinking here about, say, some of the priorities and problems coming specifically from the UN system, given that we're presenting this as part of the UN World Social Summit. So priorities and problems are being unearthed throughout the UN system at all times at multiple different levels. And, you know, a key issue is how do we kind of recognize and get hold of those specific priorities. So that would move on to the next step, which is about evidence being synthesized that responds to those priorities and being shared in open and connected data systems of the type that that John described. So this idea of having a series of connected databases and repositories that include all the evidence, which is readily classified, readily tagged with the important evidence on findings already extracted, which can be used at the endpoint. So the next step could be at the decision-making point, whether that's at a global, regional, or national level, to work on the co-production of living evidence syntheses with different stakeholders, and including the sectoral hubs that John mentioned. And then the next step is making these insights accessible to all, and then feeding back into this overall system. So it's a simplified idea here, presented as a cycle, but that's what we're aiming for. Next slide, please. So just a few different use cases here to think about how the landscape could be different for different users. And John touched upon some of these already. But if we're thinking, for example, about a UN country team policy advisor, at the moment, you know, if they're trying to say develop a strategy or a policy paper, it involves searching through multiple reports to find the relevant evidence. Sometimes this evidence is outdated and it's spread across multiple sources, and people just don't have the time to read. Okay, after in 2 years' time, we're aiming to ensure that UN country team policy advisors can be connected with national level evidence brokers that are linked to the regional hubs that John mentioned, who can help provide up-to-date and contextually relevant insights, drawing from this overall infrastructure. So the outcome is that the advice is based upon the best actionable evidence, which is contextually relevant. Next slide, please, Thomas. How about a government planner at the national level? So at the moment, they may be relying on government donor or consultant reports if they're using evidence to feed into their decision making. In 2 years' time, again, we hope to have the infrastructure in place to connect these government ministers or planners with national evidence brokers, who themselves are networked with these regional hubs, again, for support on including the latest actionable evidence. And again, this evidence and these insights are drawn from this infrastructure that we're talking about. So the outcome there is that decisions are grounded in regionally or nationally relevant and up-to-date evidence. And it's providing a basis for scaling these interventions and approaches faster and avoiding failed model. Next slide, please, Thomas. Okay, so how about a researcher or evaluator undertaking a new synthesis? So at the moment, researchers or evaluators are conducting isolated reviews. Sometimes we're duplicating work that already exists, and we're spending months and even up to a year sometimes on developing these syntheses. In 2 years' time, with this open data system and coded data sets already available, we hope that this process will reduce down to days or weeks. And the outcome is really about collaborating across the evidence community, reducing duplication, shortening the period of analysis from months to days, with each new synthesis being developed, which is actually feeding back into the system. Okay, and also the other outcome of this is that, you know, the syntheses that are undertaken are providing a basis to scope and focus new research and evaluations, because we're identifying where gaps might be, for example. Next slide, please. How about a donor agency or multilateral fund? So at the moment, commissioning bespoke reviews to justify new programming decisions. In 2 years' time, we can access these living evidence dashboards and databases. We can compare across sectors. We'll be able to compare across SDGs. We'll be able to look at questions that involve trade-offs or accelerator areas in one SDG that might contribute to progress in another SDG, with the outcome being that the transaction costs are lower, there's better coordination across agencies, and a faster identification of scalable solutions. Next slide, please, Thomas.
I think that's it.
That's me done. Okay, so I'm handing back over to Thomas. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Shiv, for looking into the crystal ball and giving us a flavor of how this could look in the near future. And I could continue listening to the different use cases and stakeholders and how they will all benefit and use, hopefully, AI-enabled evidence synthesis and our tools. So, dear participants, you heard a lot about the different initiatives, a concrete evidence synthesis on social assistance today. I'm sure even though several of you might be already experts in evidence synthesis, some others might still have questions on these different things. So please put them into either the chat or Thank you, Judith, for writing that here, or the Q&A feature. And while you think about some questions, unless we've been totally clear and you're just absolutely excited and mind blown for what is to come, just to check what you're most excited about, let me launch another poll. And in the meantime, please feel free to post questions in the chat. And this poll is just to get a feeling of all the things that you heard today, what parts of these make you most excited, and you can select multiple. And our speakers are happy to speak to these at some point. Let's see the responses coming in. And it seems a tight race, but the living evidence dashboards for sure make a lot of people excited. Same with the living inventory of the AI-enabled digital evidence synthesis tools. And I see a question there from Nia-Marie Heinonen from the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Nia-Marie, for posting the question. Nia-Marie asks, it would be interesting to hear your experience or views on how well you think AI can support synthesis processes and what types of tasks versus human analysts, experts, and evaluators I guess AI can, well, support, take over. Any one of the speakers who wants to take this question? John, over to you.
Yes, I didn't speak to one of the 5 foundational investments, which is the living inventory of AI-enabled digital evidence synthesis tools. So maybe I'll just speak about it briefly, because I think that's an excellent question. All of us are struggling with it. The aspiration with the living inventory is we'll have all of the AI tools with anything known about their performance metrics, so how they compare to current gold standard approaches. I think many of us are currently using tools that involve the use of AI to rank order the studies and the evaluations, so that we're making our initial study selection based on a probability ranked listing. In the past, many of you will know, we've often had to read through 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 titles and abstracts. AI is helping us to rank order them by probability of inclusion so that we can use our time more efficiently. In other steps, however, we don't have that confidence that we can use an AI tool safely and responsibly. So our hope is that with the living inventory, that will inform teams' choices of which AI tools to use for which tasks, and it will also support their reporting of why they used particular tools for particular tasks. The challenge in this space, of course, is that it's moving extremely quickly, and hence the need for the living inventory. Shiv, do you want to come in with some additional comments?
Yeah, hi Naya. And Naya, I know this is a kind of interesting that you're sending this question. I know that you at your end at the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you developed your own AI tool. So you should definitely be applauded for moving ahead on that. So just bouncing off what John said, I think at the moment, yes, we have tools to help us decide which evidence is relevant, right? But even those tools at the moment don't work for all forms of evidence. Okay, so from our point of view, as the UN evaluation officers or the multi or bilateral evaluation officers, there's still more work to be done to help us kind of get that sample of evidence which speaks to the topic that we're looking at. Okay, so this year we hope to see some more work on that. At the moment, AI can help us us classify and tag evaluations. There's lots of different examples of that. In many cases, a lot of those tools are still in the laboratory, and you need someone like an experienced data person to really take advantage of those tools. So this year, we hope that approaches to classifying and tagging data, which is really important in terms of creating this open data system that John spoke about. We'll move ahead on that. There are tools being developed to help quality appraise and critically appraise evidence, which is really important for the synthesis process. There's going to be a lot of progress on that. And in some ways, quality appraisal and critical appraisal is a perfect use case for AI. And yeah, the gap there, and maybe the gap we don't want to progress so much on, is in the analysis, so the stuff that comes on at the end, okay, where we still need human judgment and human interpretation. For you know, in my opinion, that will always be needed. So that will always be the human in the loop kind of part of AI, even if we manage to move really far on automating some of the other aspects. But I think that's where we are. But the main thing is that many of these tools really need to be taken out of the laboratory, be user friendly, so they can really be used at the endpoint to enable us to speed up the process and introduce these efficiencies that we're talking about. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shiv. And John Lewis unfortunately had to sign out to join another meeting and continue teaching at the university. But thank you very much to him for the presentation and responding to the question. Over to you, Carrie. I think you want to also respond.
Yeah,
to the
just
question.
one quick additional point. I mean, I completely agree with what Shiv and John were saying. I think the other point, of course, is beyond the actual production of the synthesis is all the enabling environment, the surrounding factors. So you've heard both through ESIC and more broadly the central importance placed on evidence brokers, intermediaries, etc. So beyond the actual the study or a living database or a living portal, I think that contextualization, that interpretation, that network of use and being able to plug it into knowing what sort of policy windows are coming up, what debates, how this evidence can be used, who to contact for who might know, all of that sort of relational element, I don't think can ever really be replaced by AI.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I see some other comments in the chat. One is from Ruba asking for the conceptual framework and the methodology of the synthesis report. So we will share a link with you. We have a full methodological protocol and other reports on the synthesis that is freely available on the coalition website. So you can look into that, and very soon you will find the full report there as well. Thank you for the interest. And bias is one hot topic, of course, with AI. Kivani from Ethiopia says that AI can be very helpful, but of course we have to be careful and reduce the bias. And this is also, I think, in line with a comment from the Q&A from Tina Jordman Nebe, who's actually asking, how well do current systems handle languages other than English? For example, at the level of inclusion-exclusion decisions? And what are your plans to mitigate potential language and cultural bias inherent in AI tools, given the training data? Yeah, I think we're all aware with all the hallucinations and the bias in the current available AI data that are still in there. Any speaker that wants to take that question or any experience from Attica that you would like to share, even though you haven't fully employed, of course, AI there, but in your synthesis? Okay, let me first hand over to Shivit while you sort out your thoughts on that. Shiv?
Yeah, I think it'd be useful to hear from Attica, like thoughts on the kind of representativeness of different languages in the evidence base, because that's part of the equation here. Hi, Tina. By the way, Tina is a colleague of mine at UNDP IEO, and we've been having discussions about this stuff. So she's kind of putting us on the spot here in a bigger audience. So yeah, how well do economic systems handle languages other than English? I think it's okay for some of the more say the main UN languages. I don't think we have too much of an issue there. But then there are issues when we get beyond that, right? And there are big discussions on that in the evidence synthesis community, particularly when we talk about the use of AI in terms of helping us to decide what's relevant and helping to classify. So, and some of this goes beyond synthesis. So that's not to say that this is a bigger problem that we can't sort of have a response to, because some of it goes down to the level of how research and evaluations themselves are being produced, and to what extent that research and evaluative body is taking account itself of different cultures, different languages. So there's some work to be done there, because then at the synthesis level, it depends upon what primary evidence is there. In terms of at a synthesis level, to some point the risks are reduced, because often we're kind of dealing, or we would be applying the AI tools to a kind of set sample of or set body of evidence, right? So like a closed box of evidence. So where current tools like ChatGPT, you might ask it a question, is trawling across the web and going to lots of different sources. But when we're doing synthesis and when we're trying to use AI responsibly, we're kind of using this closed box approach, which reduces some of the risk. But yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in the future in terms of inclusivity and making sure that we have different forms of evidence available from different kind of cultural contexts and different languages, and then the AI tools would need to kind of be able to handle that. And I'm not sure what the answer is there, but it's a discussion and debate happening within the community. Thanks.
Thank you, Shiv. Carrie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, my answer was going to be pretty much a carbon copy of what Shiv has just said. So, I mean, I agree. I think, I mean, obviously here we're talking about synthesis. So to a certain extent, you would hope that issues of such as these were also looked at in the initial studies, the primary studies that were produced as a first stab. I think also the ESIC regional hubs and the fact that we're trying to sort of move a lot of that architecture or infrastructure to the global south may bring these questions up a lot more to the forefront around evidence that is being produced in local languages, being published in local journals, or indeed a lot of tacit knowledge that isn't necessarily even documented at all. And I think this relates to the earlier question about, can AI do everything? I mean, this is a classic example of where you really can't, because even if we have an absolutely brilliant AI tool that can translate from one language to another, we all know that a direct translation doesn't capture all of the cultural nuances and the contextual analysis and understanding, and you really need humans and local evidence brokers and local specialists in the loop to be able to interpret beyond direct translation into a sort of cultural translation and how things may or may not work in the context in which we're considering scaling something up.
Thank you very much, Carrie, for adding on that. I'm conscious of time. We have a few minutes left for the Q&A. Atika, I know you have probably a lot of things to say about the language and the bias problem. Maybe you can share some thoughts on that, or the challenges and solutions that you encountered in the synthesis very briefly before we then would move on to the closing remarks.
Right. So, I think the problem here is that generally AI is, or currently I feel that the use of AI is just launching in general, and at least in our team, we have the feeling that you can't necessarily trust. There is some biases, and before you're aware of those biases, currently the human involvement is a little more. But just to give a few examples of where AI was used in the team and by the team. So, for example, we for the UN-led evaluations, we had a large number of non-English studies included. Some of that screening was done by the team and my colleagues through our software. And how the process was done, just to give you one quick process, was taking the keywords from English, translating them in another language, and then using the R code to basically screen studies and figure out which one has more relevant terms, which one has fewer relevant terms, and thereby sort of assessing which studies are more relevant and which less. So overall, our work was, in terms of language, was relatively limited. Our search for the quantitative or for on databases were also limited to English. So this is why, in our case, I would not say we were frequently confronted with this issue, except in the case of the qual studies, where the methods we used were sort of a little more rudimentary than the ones which would involve fancy models. Other projects we've done have used Python and such methods to scrape and to look through other language studies for key terms, where we've not found results to be as great. So my feeling so far has been from this and other syntheses that currently our team's use is rudimentary, but very happy to hear what others are doing and how this can be pushed forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atika, for sharing this experience. I see another long comment from my colleague Bikul, who's been working a lot with AI, and yeah, okay, I see also Carrie is already responding to that. So I think these are longer discussions to be had, and we're also excited in diving into that. But since we're right now rather at the end of the session, maybe we can engage on RAG and different parts and how to align best UN evaluation reports and databases in a different session. With that, I think I can hand it over for some reflections and closing remarks and some next steps to Judith. And just quickly bring up that. So yeah, Judith Friedman, thanks for already being proactively. So Judith is the head of country strategic plan evaluation unit at WFP. She joined WFP in 2020. They're the Office of Evaluation as the head of the Global Synthesis unit. Before that, she worked as an evaluator for nearly 15 years and has conducted evaluations for a wide range of organizations and around the world. Several organizations like Save the Children, Gates Foundation, UN agencies, and government departments. So she brings a lot of experience here, and Judith was also, as part of WFP, co-chair of the People Pillar Synthesis. And with that, over to you, Judith, for some reflections and closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the real art in synthesis is keeping it short. So that will be my task here. So thank you so much to everyone for your participation in this session. We wouldn't be here today if social development were progressing successfully and evenly across all contexts and for all people. And we also wouldn't be here today if we had all of the answers for what works and what's needed to ignite or accelerate progress toward the SDGs and the objectives that the international community sets for itself moving forward to confront the challenges beyond 2030. And also, finally, we wouldn't be here if AI was already set up to respond to our information needs and to answer all of our questions. So as my colleagues have explained with a lot of detail and depth and evidence, despite a wealth of data, decision-making is really often hindered by gaps in actionable, targeted, or context-specific information. So it's not that we suffer from a lack of evidence. In fact, we have more access to more information than ever at our fingertips every single moment. But we've struggled collectively to bring it all together efficiently and to share it, and also to make sure that we're generating it from the places in the world that are producing evidence that in different languages and in different contexts and in different formats beyond what we're used to in terms of research or evaluation. So what we're really trying to do is to generate lessons to understand what works for the most vulnerable in the hardest to reach places and to confront the most intractable problems. So also, as we know from watching the news, the need for social assistance is felt by the most vulnerable globally, and the opportunity to identify what works for which really has been the focus of the first people pillar synthesis is really an exciting opportunity. So we are very excited that the SDG syntheses are starting to provide some insight to answer these questions, and also that ESIC is building the structures and systems and to enable us to answer these questions and also to do it in an equitable way. So from here, I want to share an invitation to the international organizations and policymakers and researchers and evaluators that are here with us today and that are not with us and who are hopefully listening and who are involved in the social summit to join us. This is a work in progress, and it's moving very quickly, and really the invitation is open. So please share with us. Please share what your evidence gaps are, what your questions are, where you're finding answers. And we're just at the beginning, and we are really better from having you as a part of this community. So with that, I will close. Thank you so much to the co-organizers and speakers of the event, the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition, the People Pillar co-chairs, UNICEF, UNDP, WFP, UNESCO, UN Women, the Wellcome Trust, and in particular to the speakers today, Thomas, Carrie, Shiv, John, Attica, and the whole team from C4AD who worked with us on the synthesis. And finally, to the People Pillar Social Assistance Synthesis. This is something to watch. It will be published within the next couple of months, so please keep an eye out. And with that, thank you so much, and back to you, Thomas.
I think you said it all. Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you all for joining our session today. We hope you found it very insightful. I posted the links in the chat so you can have another look at ESIC and the coalition, and we hope to engage with many of you soon. So watch the space and our websites, and thank you for joining.